Hi, welcome to my Deuze vlog. My name is Mark Deuze. I'm a professor of media studies at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And my work and research is all about the health and well-being of people in creative careers, specifically the media industry. And today I'm talking about that kind of work in this particular context of the digital games industry. And my guest on the show today is none other than Dr. Johanna Weststar. And Johanna's work is profound in this space. She's been working with the International Games Developers Association since, the early 2000s on their quality of life and later on developer satisfaction surveys. Often biannual surveys involving thousands of game developers from all over the world. I mean, the survey's been translated in numerous languages, resulting in incredibly rich, detailed data on how people in the games industry are doing, what are they facing in their careers, what role do various aspects such as fair pay or overtime, job loss and all these kind of issues, how they play out in their work and their careers. Johanna is an associate professor, cross-appointed with psychology at the Department of Management and Organizational Studies at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. She's also an affiliate to the Department of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies at Western. Her specialty is labor and employment relations. And for the last 10, 15 years or so, she's been really focusing on the video game industry, where she looks at issues of workplace citizenship, representation and unionization, working conditions and the labor process, project management, and occupational identity. Last year, together, she co-authored a seminal book in this space. It's called Not All Fun and Games, published through Concordia University Press, documenting all her work over the years on studying the video game development community and analyzing it through this lens of labor relations and citizenship at work, and the ability of people in an industry to not just do the work, but also have something to say about the work and how it's organized and how it's valued and how it's managed. Johanna is a member of various industrial relations associations, both internationally as well as in Canada. She's a member of the Inter-University Research Center on Globalization and Work. So she's holding and held many positions that cut across fields of industrial relationships, work, management, and organizational studies, which she brings to bear on the study of the game industry and especially game workers. I hope you enjoy our conversation, which is part of a series of conversations which I do with people in the game industry, in all kinds of media industries, as well as the scholars that study these workers, and not just study from afar, but actually get involved in the process as Johanna Weststar has done throughout her career. Enjoy. I mean, in one of the conversations I did in this series was with Sue Rayburn, who's done work on musicians, rock and pop musicians and mental health in from the 1980s onward. And she makes, according to her, she makes this point that one of the reasons that we as academics who really care about this topic sometimes struggle to find an audience in our community is because a lot of people kind of feel, well, these people are just having fun, right? They're getting paid to do, what we all did as hobbies back in the day. So why should we? Yeah, they're struggling. So what? Is that?
They're not in a cubicle.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like these people, the people in the game development or filmmakers or musicians are being blamed for also having fun. And then when we then report on the fact, well, they're really not doing very well, and there's a lot of exploitation going on. That's sort of the price you pay. Is that something that you sometimes run up against as well?
All the time, all the
Really?
time. Yeah,
Wow.
and in the game industry, the poison pill word almost is talking about passion,
Uh,
right? They have this passion for the job, and this comes up across the literature, earlier literature in particular,
right.
when folks are looking at, okay, let's start looking at games as a workplace. Um, and it's that shift because it's everyday folks, right? Yeah, you look into the environment, it's glamorous, it's sexy,
Mhm.
it's very easy to see the product of the work
Right.
as a symbol of the work. But the disconnect is actually very, very great. And
Mm.
long hours abound in entertainment industries in terms of work cultures, the starving artist, all these kinds of motifs make it, I think, difficult to have people really pull back the layers. And I think that's something that I was really interested in doing, probably coming in as maybe that was helpful, not coming in as a like a communications or cultural industry scholar. So I wasn't coming at it from like I didn't care what the games were.
Right.
I'm a labor scholar, and I was, from the get-go kind of like there must be something here.
Mm.
Um, and and really that was kind of got me first interested in looking at the industry was it was back in 2004, early blog time. The kids these days don't remember a time when there were, not computers and stuff. So early days of blogs. And it was, this scandal where the fiance of a game worker wrote a blog
Right.
about how terribly he was being treated at Electronic Arts, which then was, one of the biggest names in games, and everyone kind of blew the top off of things
Yeah.
to say, oh, there's something going on. And so, yeah, my attention has really been to peel that back, to really understand, to not take that phrase for granted. Like, well, these people just have a passion for their work. And so, yes, they're easily self-exploited, but it's something they kind of bring on themselves. And to say, well, they're still workers, right? They're still working
Mm.
within a particular structural apparatus that is increasingly set up to make millions and billions of dollars. It's very much still a capitalist system.
Sure.
And so let's actually look at the structures that motivate their behavior, not from an individual perspective of they just love their work, to no, what are the things that are fueling that and sort of then able to use that as the scapegoat for how the industry is created.
And while we're on that history of your interest in this area, I mean, you've been involved with all these, development satisfaction surveys that
Mhm.
the International Game Developers Association has run. I mean, their 2009 Quality of Life survey, I think I saw your name on that too. I mean, I
Yeah.
distinctly remember having a chat with Jason Della Rocca back in 2006 or 2007 about these surveys, and they had this plan of doing that, and they were looking for academics to help them. And so my guess is around that time you got involved as well. I mean, how did the involvement took shape over the years? I mean, and what has it meant? What has it meant to you for your work?
Yeah, well, it looks like we had like a missed opportunity. We could have been doing this together all this time.
Yeah,
Had we known. Yeah, I mean, I was coming out. I got my PhD in 2007 in industrial relations and human resource PhD school center at the University of Toronto. And one of my like fears was that I would never have a good idea again for something to research, right?
wow, yeah,
This is like an early career scholar kind of sense.
yeah,
And it was during my PhD that this EA spouse scandal occurred.
right.
And I was looking around me at my colleagues and again, seeing people really studying a lot of very standard unionized industries, but also hearing that unions were dead. And collective action was dead and they were on the decline and we were in a whole new space. And I thought, okay, well, what am I going to do? And I saw the 2004 quality of life survey that the IGDA did themselves, largely an in-house effort with, kind of a bunch of volunteers, and they
Right.
set up a quality of life committee at that point. Again, all around this press that EA and this blog were getting, it was kind of an inflection point, I would say.
Hmm.
And and that report was really interesting and very candid, and identified a lot of the problems that workers were facing. And so, uh, out of my PhD, I thought, well, surely they're going to do another one. That would be great, right? But now
Right.
we're getting on to these. Oh, it's 3 years later. Oh, it's almost 4 years later. And same, I connected with a colleague who I ended up doing a lot of my work in this field with, Marie-Josée Legault. We met at a conference, and she was doing some early interviews of game developers, and we thought, oh well, let's see how this goes. And Jason Della Rocca was the executive director of the IGDA, and it happened to be based in Montreal, so that
Right.
that made it helpful for us, because my colleague Marie-Josée was in Montreal, and we had a meeting with him, and it was sort of a classic case of scholars need data and sometimes funding, and industries need time and people power, and
Mm.
that's kind of the very informal situation that we struck. And he said, oh yeah, we have this quality of life committee, there are a couple workers working on it, but these were workers who were just doing it off the side of their desk, right? That
Right.
they're doing their day job, but because they have an interest, they're trying to keep this alive. And so we partnered up with them, and then it kind of, I think it's 6 executive directors later,
Hmm.
I've worked with, to shape it, into sort of what it is today. And Kate Edwards, she was a very influential executive director,
Right.
and really took an interest and a focus on the survey. And that's when it changed its name to the Developer Satisfaction Survey, and got a little longer. Arguably, it's kind of a beast as a survey, I have to say. No experts in survey design would be giving like a gold star, probably, because it is lengthy, but it's really the only of its kind
Yeah.
that has been so consistent in asking kind of the same set of questions over time. And so other surveys come and go, right, on salary or on this or on that, and they're all very useful in the space, because it's desperately hard to find data on some of this stuff.
Right.
And but what the DSS has going for it is this sort of consistency and its sort of value as this like long-term benchmarking tool. So we got a little excited for a while, and the IGDA thought we could do it every year, and that was just not sustainable at all for
Right.
the kind of size that it is. So we've managed to sort of start pulling it back a little bit, so it's not going to be quite as frequent. That's why the last one we did was 2023. I think we'll do another one, probably in 2027, early 2027. We'll
Right.
pull it out,
Right.
because it's translated in like 7 different languages. So, anytime you want to make a change to the survey, this is like a massive cascade of what
Yeah.
you have to be doing. But yeah, it's been an excellent partnership with that body. And their current executive director, Jake Vela, he's got a PhD in sociology himself.
Uh-huh.
So that also helps, because he really sort of understands the research side of it as well.
Yeah, you would almost wonder whether the fact that, one thing that is slightly different, maybe among game developers as a media workforce compared to, for example, journalists or filmmakers, is their, the fairly consistent high level of education. So the more familiarity with, the value of research and quantitative research. And I don't know, that might be a silly hypothesis, but it does back to, I mean, your that incredible involvement over all those years and all those surveys. And like you said, these surveys are quite candid and sometimes reveal issues that are quite problematic about the industry. I mean, both that people love doing what they do, but also struggle in the process with a variety of issues. I mean, and in your publications around this, you've always very clearly and candid both the reports on the surveys as well as your academic work. You know, that contrast between your paint that you paint between an industry that likes to portray itself and also the developers themselves talk about, you know, this is fun, this is we're paid to play. I mean, it's kind of loosey goosey and I'm free and playful and all those, you know, lovely things that would draw anyone to a place of work. And then you contrast it, well, yes, but there's also a stark reality, you know, a very secretive, very competitive industry not likely to take big risks, a very gendered culture. I mean, the work, yes, you get a contract, but it's always project-based work. I mean, there's a lot of, yeah, there's an expectation of just giving it all you've got. I mean, crunch is, of course, the term that comes to mind immediately. I mean, I guess my question about that is on the one hand, I mean, how have you been able to communicate this story also to the developer community itself? And are they, I mean, there are, has their willingness to hear this changed over time or to engage with it in any constructive way? I mean, and that will be my follow-up question. What kind of development have you seen in this space over all
Yeah.
those years that you've been involved with this?
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean it's also an industry that is just rapidly changing as well. So
Hmm.
it's one that's it's sort of hard to keep up with. Um, but I think there is much more clarity and much more awareness, both among the workers who do the work, but also in the gamer community, because that's a whole other beast,
Right.
is the interplay between the game players and the game developers. They're very, very close to their consumer base. And over time, over my time of studying this industry, become increasingly close. And so that's a really amazing opportunity for discussion and dialogue and resistance sometimes, that the players will get a bit enraged sometimes if they hear about scandals in the industry. And not every industry kind of has that ability to sort of leverage their community, but sometimes the community doesn't care. And they just want a good game at the end of the day. And I think that's sort of been the struggle in over the course of time. And I mean, this industry's really only been around since the 1970s, right? It's maturing every day. But there have been these blips on the radar over the course of history of when workers have kind of risen up, they've had a little resistance moment around something, and then it sort of falls away. And then time goes by, and then, oh, now there's something else. And sometimes that would be, usually it would be like around a specific company. So, oh, Ubisoft's in the news for sexual harassment scandal. Oh, Blizzard is in the news for, and it has been, sexual harassment scandals have been the name of the game, let's say, in the more recent years, that seem to have been a really sustained way to mobilize workers,
Hmm.
where the long hours and the crunch was a problem, but that didn't seem to kind of tip the envelope in quite the same way or galvanize the community in quite the same way. Whereas, what we were seeing around Activision Blizzard and Ubisoft, where gamers themselves and game developers, like they were making in-game protest art and doing all of these really interesting things. Um, and that really, I think, what started sparking some of the unionization efforts, because it sort of attracted some of these, some of the established unions, which we can get to. But I think for me, it's always been a desire for me to engage in research that does give back to the group that I'm engaged with.
Yeah.
Kind of that, whatever you want to call it, applied research, activist research, if you go that far.
Hmm.
But that's why I think working with the IGDA has been really valuable and rewarding, because um, really focused on producing like industry facing reports out of that data
Yeah.
that are, not super highfalutin in terms of the stats and all these kinds of things, but just like, let's present the data out there. Let's put this in the hands of the people that might use it in a way that could perhaps, spark dialogue and or make change. And and part of that is participating in like industry conferences. So, I've been to the Game Developers Conference a couple of times and presented a panel about unions there, presented a panel about the IGDA data. And over time at GDC, there's now one of the conference tracks is called the advocacy track.
Mm,
And like I'm not saying I had anything to do with that, but it's an example of how the sort of the zeitgeist and sort of the notion of what we talk about in these spaces has changed. And so almost all the talks in that track are about games as workplaces
mm,
or like games for change or other things like that, which we would not have seen at all
right.
before this sort of building momentum. And that's, I think, quite interesting. Um, and I've also given some talks to employers. Like I've been
Mm,
invited to present in front of some human resource teams in large studios that will remain unnamed.
mm,
Um, because they are also interested. And I haven't had that much opportunity yet. Maybe it's a future project to really kind of look at that piece in these larger studios where there is a human resource presence. The sense is that they are often kind of squeezed.
mm,
And folks in HR have an idea. Sometimes it's idealistic and from a labor perspective, we can poke a lot of holes in human resource management theory and assumptions.
mm,
Um, but but many are sort of like, yeah, working these long hours is not awesome, right? Or doing things like this is not great. How can we do things in a different way? So there are different allies at different places in the system, and I think it would be interesting to learn more about how some of those forces work within studios, because they're all pushing against the same imperative, and it's really the imperative that the game sells that is at the heart of everything. And if you can make arguments that hitch your wagon to having a successful game, that's what is going to capture the attention, of shareholders, of managers and things like that. Because
mm,
really all the structural elements around the levers that make the work difficult, that produce crunch, that sometimes produce toxicity, are just like what I've talked about, sort of the reification of the game. That
mm,
if your game doesn't ship and if it's not a success, everyone is done.
mm.
All that work you put in, right? Because this is a boom and bust environment. And
Yeah.
so the imperative is the game has to be good and the
Mm,
game has to sell because that's how you get capital to build your next game. And so reputation and the stress of sort of what a reputational based environment does, the portfolio based careers, all of those different pressures really come to bear around that idea that at the end of the day, you're going to do whatever you can do to make sure that game is a success because that's your livelihood. And everybody shares that imperative. So
mm.
there's some common ground there. But it's sort of how does it manifest in the system?
The I appreciate what you're saying about doing research that gives back or has a direct relation to the people you're doing research on, right? And like you said, you can call it applied research or activist. A term that I recently came across that I really appreciate that reminds me of the work that you do is non-extractive science.
Oh, I like
Right?
that.
You don't just take data from a community and then have nice publications or whatever, but you actually immediately, like you, the way you describe the reports that you write, right? I mean, they're about empowering the people that you surveyed and the rest of the community there. So the non-extractiveness. I really like that kind of metaphor.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. I mean, it's hard though too because, and I'm not sure if you experienced this with your work, but we as academics, of course, also work in an apparatus
Mm.
of proving our worth,
Hmm.
and I've had to, and I'm very happy with the environment that I'm in, that it really does appreciate a big range of what counts as research. But I would say, like, I have as many non-peer reviewed publications that are industry facing as probably peer reviewed ones. And sometimes it is like, okay, well, I need to get some academic publications out of this ITDA data. How am I going to do that?
Right.
Because the focus really around the survey was so much more um, in that kind of benchmarking, sort of frequency data kind of vein, and we weren't, crafting questions in a certain way that were necessarily academically framed. And so there's a tension there too, right? In sort of, um, I guess us as scholars kind of continually to push the envelope of like what matters to you in the kind of work that we do.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, these days, when some organization is kind enough, and especially university departments, kind enough to invite me to talk a little bit about the research or about the book, I tend to preface my statements with, look, everything I'm saying now applies to work at the university as well. I
Yeah.
mean, sure, different ways and all that kind of stuff. So, which leads me to, I mean, you talked a bit about unionization, and one of the many things that always strike me about the surveys that you've done among the game developer community is sort of a growing, over time, generally speaking, growing support for unionization or collective action, and all, both in terms of the survey data as well as, like you said, in the way game developer communities respond to stories in the news. And there's
Yeah.
like solidarity and hashtag activism and stuff like that. And if I understand it correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, like one of the ways you frame all of this also as a kind of an argument, like how the industry can move forward, is a type of citizenship at work.
Mhm.
And I really like that because it to me it seems to encapsulate more than sort of formal collective action like through unions, but there's all kinds of other ways of being, yeah, a citizen at work. I mean, and that's something that we find in smaller studies that we're doing here in the Netherlands as well, is that media workers, whether it's journalists or people in ad agencies, do organize and do try to change things at their places of work, but it tends to be outside the realm of formal union action. And so, how do you capture that? And can you talk a little bit more about this concept of yours, this citizenship at work notion?
Yeah, for sure. It's a borrowed term
Hmm.
from labor relations literature, emerging in the 1960s, when unions, at least in North America or the U.S. and Canada, were kind of in a heyday time, and all of these industrial relations structures were being set up, and there was a real debate between, well, what's going to be the best way to protect workers or to balance out the power relationship, right, between capital and labor. And there were folks talking about universal rights, like universal social protections, like social security systems.
Hmm.
And then there were also folks talking about more of this on the ground representation, the voice side, participation in your day-to-day work, and the ability to shape that. And that really was seen to be most likely to come about through a certified trade union. And through that, there was sort of this idea, and it used to be called industrial citizenship, but the word industrial is a little old now.
Mm.
So it's sort of morphed into citizenship at work. But the pillars are sort of the same. And so the four that we look at are, to what degree do you have protection against employment risks in your workplace, whether that's job loss, whether that's you get sick, you get injured, you retire, and that really is kind of focusing on that legal landscape, looking at sort of those universal social rights and what protections do we have there. Um, then more so in the workplace, in this, as you say, kind of this middle ground, what what recourses does a worker have against arbitrary treatment?
Mm.
We talk a lot, Marie-Josée and I, in our book about discretionary decision making, and there is a lot of discretionary decision making in the game industry. Again, because it goes back to that informal sort of garage hacker roots of running a studio, right? And a lot of these
Mhm.
people, they're not trained in management, even now that the industry is so mature. And so decisions, there aren't formal processes, there aren't checks and balances. There's a real lack of transparency in how a lot of decisions are made, and that produces risks. It produces massive inequities that then lead to problems. So those are two pillars there, and then the other two pillars, it's I guess it's a table. I don't know. Some people talk about a three-legged stool. This is like a proper chair. So participation in the local regulation of labor, and most would see this
Mm.
as like through a union. So can you have voice? Can you bring ideas to your employer in a way that they have to at least listen to you to some degree? And then to what degree are you able to participate in the social regulation of labor?
Mm.
So can workers participate in big discussions about the shape of their industry, about what kind of work they want to do, like about government lobbying, right? About how laws are set to begin with. And all of these things together can give you a good litmus test of sort of how much citizenship or how much participation, how much voice is there for workers in these different places. And and that idea seemed to fit really nicely with the game industry because if we go back to the idea of like the glamour and the assumption of like, well, you're all well educated, you're doing these nice jobs, you work in these offices with all of this fabulous technology around you, all the imagery of game studios, they've got all these cool little knickknacks all over the place, right? You've got a
Right.
snack bar, you've got a foosball table. Of course, this is glorious. Um, but are you a citizen of your workplace? And in that, do
Mm.
you have rights that we would expect and maybe take for granted in a democratic space? And I think something that always really surprises my students when I'm teaching like a first year labor relations course is talking about how out here, I'm a citizen, right? I have political citizenship, I have social citizenship, I can vote, we do all these things. And then I step over the threshold into my workplace and I am in an authoritarian relationship
Right.
where I now have lost all my democratic rights by crossing in and joining this employment relationship unless we build those up through structures. And so that's kind of the frame that we used to ask that question.
Mm.
Well, are these highly educated workers who seemingly love their jobs, are they actually participating in their work and are they able to shape their work and are they protected against risks?
Mm.
And the answer is no on most
Right.
of those questions, that there
Yep.
is a really, really big citizenship gap where they're really just floating along at the whim of the markets. In many jurisdictions, game developers are actually excluded from some of the labor legislation. So in Canada and the US, overtime legislation doesn't apply to game workers.
Mm.
They've been exempted.
Yeah.
So there are some interesting, features there that come into play and help us understand um, that space a little bit better, and a little bit is political dynamics because a lot of it is sort of these lack of formalized structures, transparency, accountability, and decision making, access to social support systems, access to unions. All of these come into play, and that's where unions are still seen, and the labor relations systems, in my country and your country are very different, but unions are still seen as one of the major tools to equalize the power imbalance that we see in workplaces.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned a book that you co-authored. I mean, not all fun and games. I mean,
Mhm.
very powerful, very powerful piece of work. And I definitely want to talk a little bit more about it, but maybe you can help me understand something. Like what's going on in Canada? because there's so much incredible work on this kind of and these kind of issues coming from Canadian scholars. Nicole Cohen's work on the
Yeah,
rights of journalists,
absolutely.
and of course the late Vincent Moscow and Catherine McCurker and Greg de Puyter. I mean, there's so many incredible colleagues doing work that is both incredibly empirically grounded in the real world, like you said, the stark reality of these industries, and it has this really critical but also kind of it's just I mean it's just amazing work. And I mean, I've asked the same question to colleagues in Australia, because it's Australia and Canada that sort of seem to be leading the charge here. But I mean, so of course, thank you for that incredible work. But where do you think that comes from? That kind of analytical perspective on media work and production that it's so hard to find anywhere else.
It's interesting. It's a really interesting question. My one thought when you were listing all of those names of people is, well, they all just hung out with each other.
That
It
that's
is
it.
maybe the short answer,
Yeah.
honestly, Mark.
It's
Like
yeah.
it's a small enough space
Right.
that I mean, I was at a I was still no, I must have been in my first year, I think, of academic work.
Mm,
And I was at a conference at actually Western University, where I am now,
right.
in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, Media Science, and it's a very radical sort of hotbed for Marxist and neo-Marxist thinking as applied to the communication and cultural industries. Fabulous place. Um, and they put on a conference, and most of the people that you just listed were in the room. So I
Interesting.
think
Yeah.
part of it is that is there was a moment, a cultural moment in time where a lot of people sort of connected and really resonated in those spaces and were studying kind of different industries in the same way under the
Yeah.
same vein. Because like Greg Deputer and Nick Dyer-Witherford's work on games, like their two early books were
Mhm.
foundational for the
Sure.
study of game development, and now Nicole and Greg, have put out their work on how the digital media workers unionized, which was wonderful, and just such a detailed accounting of like how that happened step by step. And that then becomes a model, right,
Yeah.
for others who are coming behind them. Yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting though.
Yeah, and in a way, this mirrors how a lot of the hiring processes in the media industry go. Like people bring their friends along to projects, and they hire
For
people
sure.
they know. And I mean, not necessarily, oh, we're go look at your CV and count how many projects you've done. It's sort of, well, do I know you? Can I get along? So when we're in crunch, we can hang out and we can still be, yeah, that's. It's
Yeah,
such a yeah, that makes actually perfect sense. So thanks
yeah.
for I wish I was at that conference. I mean I was working in Indiana at the time, and I do remember there were always these gatherings in Canada about stuff like this. Yeah,
Yeah.
that so now yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for
I think
illuminating
it's
that.
it's sort of in that vein of like find your community and make your space. And I
Yeah.
think in the US too, I mean, um,
Mm,
US scholars have suffered a lot more under just the very pervasive attack on unions, and
mm,
on kind of all sort of critical lenses at work. There's still a lot of wonderful academics, a lot of wonderful activists, of course, in that
yeah.
space, and tremendous work coming out now around new forms of organizing and different things like that. But in Canada, we've been able to maintain a little bit more strongly, I think, that sort of social democratic value system. Um, Hold on to that a little bit more, and that I think makes some of those narratives and seeing ourselves as more similar to some of the European narratives, where a lot of these um, uh, different, perhaps more radical thinkers in terms of employment and resistance
Sure.
have come from. It's sometimes it may be a little bit of an easier jump there, but that's speculation.
Right. Uh, um, um, So yeah, so there is some really great scholarship, and yes, a lot of it tends to be Canadian on sort of critical analysis of work and labor and production in different kind of media industries, and of course your work in the game industry is just amazing, but not but and how it does raise the question. I mean, I do like to cut in analysis across different industries because, shared narratives, finding common cause feels like, oh, you've got a bigger fist to slam the table with, standing up for rights and those kind of things. On the other hand, there are, of course, significant differences between, game developers or ad creatives or investigative journalists or something like that. And one thing that has always struck me, and the IGDA is exemplary in that sense, is that the game industry in and of itself is such a global industry. I mean,
Yeah.
global production networks. Yes, we see them in television and film, but often then the crews still tend to be quite local. But in the game industry,
Mm.
there's much more of that international, transnational mobility, networking, almost an expectation. I mean, Guerrilla Games here in Amsterdam, I think most of their crew is from all over the world, right? And
Yeah.
they come to Amsterdam to work on Horizon Zero Dawn or something like that. And would you see that as well as something that really adds a unique element to the game's workforce, and how does this affect the experiences of people working in the game industry?
Mhm. I mean, I think to your first point first, like we do really have to be careful of the exceptionalism argument. And
Yeah.
it's so easy, especially when you're talking to activists in a space, for them to see their experience as something very exceptional.
Mm.
And I think that's something that collaboration, right, between scholars and activists or workers in various ways can really help frame up to say, no, 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 let's look at film,
Yeah.
right? Like, hold on, folks. Actually, let's talk about sectoral bargaining and let's talk about how it's worked over in this industry for a long time. Yes, it got set up under different conditions, but right. So that
Mm.
I think that is something that's really important for us to be able to do generally. But on the other question, I'd agree with you that games itself is so diverse in-house that it's almost like you're dealing with, well, you are doing a cross-occupational study every time you engage with games because who are you talking about as a game developer? Are you talking about a computer programmer? Are you talking about a visual artist? Are you talking about a voice actor? Are you talking about a quality assurance tester? Because these, and that's just four groups,
Mm.
they have fundamentally different work processes, tool sets. Sometimes the pay is different, right?
Mm.
Testers tend to be hourly paid, the others not. Actors just come and go. They're, unionized over in a totally different space. So that's one piece that sort of continually makes us have to say, who are we talking about when
Mm.
we say game developers? And sometimes we need to zero in more, I would think, on certain occupational groups because there's quite an occupational hierarchy there that
Sure.
I don't think we've kind of fully unpacked. But then, as you say, not only that, we have people working on projects across studios that are sometimes across the entire world. And the industry has become increasingly financialized, right? It's moved more. There's a high kind of merger and acquisition culture in games where because the risk is so high of a failed game, and brands matter, and past successes matter, a larger body is always looking around for studios that maybe started out as these like, small, scrappy independent studios. Once they get to about a mid-level size, they get scooped up. And if one thing that's been really interesting to me in the IGDA data is like you can see that there's no middle. There's a very small middle of these medium-sized enterprises. We've got the small ones, we've got the big ones, but I really think it's because when indies become successful, then the big players scoop them and they keep them as a subsidiary with their same name, their same branding, because they want to build on that legacy and reputation. But now they're owned in this increasingly financialized hierarchical cone.
Right.
And what that does is allows for the internationalization so much more, where Sony or Ubisoft or whoever can have studios all over the place.
Mm,
But that introduces its own risks,
mm.
because then you start seeing, and capital is always more mobile than workers, right? At its heart. And in games, capital is very mobile because there's not a lot of physical apparatus. Yeah, everyone needs a variety of computers and game consoles. Otherwise, there's not equipment in this industry. And companies chase tax credits like crazy. They chase government incentives to go where they're going to be able to make a game more cheaply, and they'll do that in a heartbeat. And that internationalization side adds to the instability of the industry. We also then see, and it's classic globalization, right? Where you have work going to lower wage areas. So Eastern Europe has really benefited a lot from building a skilled and talented base of game developers.
Ukraine. Yeah, that's
Ukraine,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Poland.
yeah.
A lot of big games are coming out of there because they've had these subsidiaries that have been successful, and now they're, what do they call it? Like the acorn effect, the big oak tree, and it drops its
Right.
acorns, and then you get the local industry that grows up around. So they're good sides, but it also, from someone sitting in California, with a massive standard of living costs, are going to be afraid that their work is going to go to Poland or Czechia or Ukraine or the next emerging market, Brazil or something like that, right?
Right. Right.
So all of that adds to the general instability, the churn, the flux. And then because we have these larger players um, who are essentially, the owners of these different companies, they can very quickly just say, this game's not viable. We're closing you down. No,
Sure.
we're selling off that studio now. We're going to open one over here, or we're going to retreat. And that happened to Australia. The 2008 financial crisis essentially gutted the game industry in Australia because
Right.
it was only alive because of a few of these big multinationals.
Yeah.
And in the financial crisis, they retreated, right? They pulled back to their core
Yeah.
and nothing was left. Now, Australia is a brilliant case study because what they've done instead is grow this very, very vibrant, almost entirely independent game ethos.
Mm.
And there's really interesting work coming out of there, Brendan Keogh and colleagues,
Yeah.
about like how can we re-envision the game industry without these big players, right? How
Mm.
can we do this in a way where we are participating in a more cooperative ecosystem? And so it creates these interesting spaces, but definitely the internationalization just makes it just a little more unstable, in all of those dimensions. Not to mention the day-to-day work where now, I'm working with a team that's 6 hours ahead or 14 hours ahead.
Sure.
And that, influences your workflows. It influences how much do you feel um, that you have a handle on and that you're contributing to the whole project. This is something in the like workplace control literature or worker autonomy literature that we know is very good for workers to be able to their feel like their piece is part of the whole. They can see the whole vision. But when you've got the game spliced up over a bunch of different places, it's easier to feel more siloed too.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
then, there are technical difficulties with sort of putting those pieces back together. So there are lots of different effects to how the industry has shaped out that way in terms of its internationalization for sure.
Yeah, and you raised such an important point about the churn that gets involved in and becoming part with your little shop, your little studio, often with your friends that you've
Yeah,
built up, and you become part of a multinational, transnational, global industry through mergers, acquisition, or whatnot. And then at some point you get spat out again, and that's almost inevitable. And there's a sort of an acceleration of that process happening. Absolutely. I
yeah,
mean, something similar happens in the advertising industry with just five shops owning, holding firms, owning studios all over the world and agencies.
huh,
And one thing that, I mean, for me doing the research across these different media industries, one thing that I always find so shocking, to be honest, and also the most difficult, and that's something we share to explain to students, is exactly this churn, this incredible loss of talent that happens, that seems to be built into how the system is designed. Like,
yeah.
the majority of people in film, television never work on more than one product. I mean, the average length of a journalism career now is, 3 to 5 years tops before people sort of say, like, yeah, I can't really do this anymore.
I need to
And
buy a house at some point, right? Like,
yeah, I need to have at least some moderate level of predictability here, and
yeah,
or at least some relation. I have to feel some relation between the work I put in and whether I'm gonna keep that job, right? And
yeah,
if it seems to be disconnected, whether you get hired or fired, whether that has anything to do with showing up first or being really talented. And I know you've mentioned before in when we were preparing this that you're working on a project specifically on the first years of people on the job. I mean, can you
yeah.
speak a little bit to that and how this relates to this churn or the way that talent gets treated in these industries?
Yeah, it's I've been very lucky to I was sort of pulled into this project called The First 3 Years.
Mm,
And it's being the PI is Sean Guglis. He's out of the University of Alberta, and Jen Whitson, who has written a lot about the indie game scene, and Alison Harvey, who's also written a lot about
oh yeah, Alison,
like
yeah.
the gendered nature, yeah, of the industry. So it's like a all-star team. I'm so happy to work with them. Um, but the idea is, how do people get jobs in this
Mm,
industry, and why, do we see in the survey data exactly this, that you ask people, how long are you going to work in this industry, and they say, I have no idea, or they say, well, for the next couple of years. And we see a lot of loss, a lot of burnout. We see a lot of people kind of not succeeding,
mm,
and that's just gotten worse in the last number of years, where every day there seems to be the next layoff happening. So the last couple of years have just been a disastrous from a worker's perspective,
yeah.
restructuring of the industry. And yeah, so this project, what we did was we recruited. We have about 200 people who were enrolled in games studies programs, game development, game design. We were, fairly open on that in Canada and the US. And we interviewed them in their final year of their game program.
Mm,
And then we've interviewed them every year for the next 3 years about their journey. And many of them, at least half of the sample, have never found a first job in games.
wow.
And others, have been kind of bumped around. Some others are the success story, right? That we
Mm,
hear about. They get an internship, they land a job, and they're still there and they're doing great. But for many of them, it's been a real struggle,
mm,
and it's tricky. And again, this is a complex space, right? Trying to, if we could match, right, people and jobs, we would solve a lot of problems probably. And economists and whatever talk about full employment models and all these kinds of things. But I think what we're finding in this project is kind of looking at the different actors involved, especially in that early space, that the companies don't want to invest in training because they need people to do the job yesterday, right? They're working on this project cycle. They don't have time to mess around. They
sure.
need this. You got to come in. You got to do it. That's that. So there's no culture of bringing somebody up, and that contributes to the churn, and it's increasingly contributing to there's most of the people in games are still sort of hired nominally on a full-time permanent basis. Um, but we are seeing a lot of contract workers as well. And again, it's because studios are just like, I don't want to keep someone on all the time. I just want to bring them in for what I need. And that's all part of that intense project cycle that they have.
Mm.
But then you've got educational institutions who are also feeling financial crises. I don't know, again, how it is in the Netherlands, but
Oh, yes.
in Canada, it's desperate. Universities are really, really strapped for cash, and they want to chase programs that will attract students, and games attract students, right? It's a very sexy program
Right.
for these students to go in. And it's been easy in some ways to like tack a games label on your computer science course, right? Or on your communications and cultural program, you put a little game certificate in there. So we've ended up with really quite a patchwork of different program types that to the industry are hard to distinguish, right? As an outsider, I don't know, you look at someone's transcript, how do you really know what skills they're learning, what's going on? And so we've just submitted this paper around like kind of this credentialization problem
Right.
where we have increasing numbers of graduates flooding the market seeking entry level jobs, which don't exist because companies don't want to train. And now with all the layoffs, they really don't exist because there are middle and senior developers out there on the market now looking for jobs. And the industry doesn't understand the credential. So it actually doesn't really value the credential. And it's like, well, I don't really care what you did in your school. Just show me your portfolio. Do you know how to make a game or not? Yeah, okay. Does your art look good to me? Great, come in. So there's a real disconnect. But meanwhile, students are sort of being sold a bill of, well, if I get a game degree, I'll get a job in games.
Right.
So it's this like triangle that is not fitting together
Mm.
in a good way. And then you layer on top of that the the fact that some game studios are not great places to work, right? In terms of culture, whether that's around gender, whether that's around, kind of other factors. It tends to be gender most of the time. That sort of
Mm.
toxic masculinity kind of culture that the industry is still working on.
Sure.
But also the long hours and things like that, that ultimately we know affect women more, but they end up affecting everybody. And I've spoken to a lot of men developers who say, I can't keep this up and,
Right.
and maintain my home life or my hobbies or anything I like either. So all of those things kind of come to a bit of a head with these careers. But the solution, describing the problem is easier than coming up with the solutions for sure. But I think what we're learning from this first 3 years project is that the folks who tend to land better, whether that's in games or not, are ones who do have a bit more of the generalist background. Like if you're too specialized early on,
Mm.
you're more at risk, right? Because you're seeking a specific opportunity, and if that one doesn't come, you're in trouble, or if that one
Right.
is not needed, you're in trouble. Where if you have a bit more of a generalized background, you can work your way in games, or you could go somewhere else and apply those skills. But that's probably something we would have said about education in a lot of different spheres. Um,
That's
I'm
it's
interested too in like and some might be opposed to this idea, but there are these industries that have like really good occupational closure we would talk about.
right.
Um, Lawyers, doctors, accountants, skilled trades, where you need to have a certain certification that is meaningful in order to do the work. And industries like that are generally better able to sort of manage the supply and demand challenges. Sometimes it becomes a negative thing because they could become too closed.
Sure.
Um, but in games, given that we do have this real dearth of the training mentality,
Mm.
I'm very intrigued by what like a skilled trades kind of apprenticeship model would look like in an industry like this. Um, and and if the industry starts unionizing more, maybe there's a role there to play in sort of setting something like that up.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it makes me also aware of how schools, universities are implicated in this business model, right? I mean,
Oh,
like
yes.
you say, like you know, you slam media, communication, games, journalism, film onto any kind of degree title, and students line up. And that's, yeah, that's how universities get paid. And so for us to then advocate, like for example, George Musgrave and Sally Ann Gross in the UK, when they write about the music industry, they actively write, aren't we selling the idea of a career in pop or rock music to too many people? I
Yeah,
mean, they all should be making music, but you know, for themselves.
yeah,
But yeah, music degrees are so popular, and so I've seen that argument being made. But then again, yeah, we have way too many students in our media program, and but this year we're having 100 students less than last year, and we still have like 700 or 800, which is insane.
wow.
And there's a panic. Everybody's like, we should go and talk to high schools. And I was like, no, we should only have 100 students. That's already too much, right? But it's just the
Yeah,
business model. And yeah,
yeah,
that's really problematic. And this whole notion of turning your creativity into a career. I mean, like what you said about generalists and specialists. I mean, I wonder if you also see how this applies not just to, you know, what specific position or skill set you're looking at, but also that it relates to one's perspective of the industry as a whole. I mean, I'm asking because some of the research that we've been doing looks at like why do some journalists, for example, freelance journalists, thrive in the current
mm,
industry setting, which is really tough for freelancing in general, especially in journalism, and other journalists just keep on hitting a brick wall and at some point burn out. And one of the things that we found that is really different is the way they look at the industry.
mm,
And that's really relates to what you're saying. The journalist who is most likely to burn out says, as long as I get a story on the front page of the New York Times, right? Or in the top quality newspaper or news organization in my country. That's my folk. That's what being a real journalist is all about. You know,
yeah,
I get my story on national public broadcast news, whatever. And so they keep pitching, they keep trying, and of course 99.99% of yeah, that's not going to happen. But the reporters that kind of like, you know, I have expertise, I have a passion for a certain topic, and I don't really care whether that feeds the R&D for a documentary film or it can serve as the text for a booklet that comes with an art exhibition, or I'm going to
sure.
write a public book, I'm going to give a couple of talks, you know, use a translation service and sell my stories to other countries and other media. It's like when they see the industry as sort of a smorgasbord of options rather than
Yeah.
I have to do this one thing, it really speaks to, it seems, to what you're saying as well, is that a more
Mm,
generalist perspective, not sort of being absolutely fixated on, well, I can only do this one thing, play guitar in a metal band. Well, that's very nice, but being a working musician is actually a skill set that you can apply in a lot of different ways. Is
yeah,
that
yeah.
a discussion that you're having and that
Chris,
you're seeing?
I'm going to bring that back to the group. I think that's really, really interesting that, and probably sort of with that in mind, kind of looking at the data, it is because we asked them, right, like, well, where do you want to work? What do you want to do?
Right.
And some of them are definitely much more specific, right? Like, I need to be working on a AAA game or, you know, in a AAA studio making games like this. And as you say, that's going to be harder. Whereas
Mm.
the person who was um, essentially a texture artist who didn't find a job in games and is now running a landscaping business that they created themselves
Wow.
is quite thrilled.
Yeah.
and is, using a lot of their same interest in the environment, just in a really different way. That's maybe one of the more dramatic kind of examples, but um, yeah, I think you have to be flexible in this space. And again, you know, there are individual drivers. Like some of these are sort of individual outlook pieces, right, that we're talking about. And then there are also kind of these structural drivers, but they come together
Mm.
to dictate whether you're successful or not successful. And there's too much variability in this space. The tech is changing constantly.
Yeah.
You know, as of 5 years ago, they games were fundamentally different. Right now we have games as a service, like these subscription-based games.
Yep.
Um, they're quite different. We have community managers that weren't those jobs didn't exist before. There are a whole bunch of new jobs around data analytics of now, really squeezing the blood out of the stone on all of this player use data to get them to, monetize and pay more money. Those jobs never existed before. So
Mm.
it's a space where, yeah, um, lifelong learning is a bit of a cliche, but in this space, it's very, very critical. And again, then it's all tied back to, well, what did you do lately, right? Show me what you can do.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Well, well, Janet, I mean, this was absolutely lovely conversation,
yeah.
and I mean, the book is a stark reminder, not all fun and games of, yeah, that I mean, to me, so much of the argument that you and Marie-Josée make in the book applies across all these industries, and it's such a powerful and important point. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. And really, really so appreciative of the work that you're doing in this space.